Good morning, afternoon, or evening, and welcome to the October webinar of the Society of Wetland Scientists. Today we have two speakers of the SWS Ramsar Section, Nick Davison and Rob McGuinness. My name is Jos Verhoeven, and I will be the moderator of your webinar today. We will have 45 minutes of presentation and 15 minutes for questions and announcements. We are proud to announce that this webinar has been pre-approved by the SWS Professional Certification Program and is applicable for 0.06 continuing education credits that can be applied to your professional wetland scientist certification application or renewal. As a reminder, further participation certificates are available upon request as well. Please contact the SWS staff if you are interested. Today, you can see that past webinars are also available, and you can see how you can get to them. And again, you can have certificates for those too. Today, October 18, is the SWS Twitter Symposium all day. Here is some information for Twitterers on what to include in tweets during the webinar. I hope, and we all hope, that as many people as possible, as many members will participate in the Twitter Symposium, which will have a much larger outreach than this webinar. Some housekeeping items. If you have problems with your audio, you can enter the audio pane to the right of your screen and switch to another source. There is also a questions pane, which is very important. Should you have any questions during the webinar, you can enter questions in there. And at the end, in the question session, these questions that have been entered will be used by me to read to the two speakers for stimulating the discussion. In the handouts pane, you can download a slide deck of the presentation. And it's now time to introduce you to our presenters. The first presenter is Nick Davison. He has over 40 years experience in ecology assessment and conservation of coastal and inland wetlands. He is now working as an independent expert consultant on wetland conservation and wise use issues around the world. He has been the Deputy Director General of Ramsar Convention, and also he has been leading the convention's scientific and technical review panel. He has been the coordinator of international NGO Wetland International as well. Rob McGuinness is an independent chartered environmentalist and a professional wetland scientist with over 25 years of experience in wetland-related environmental research, consultancy, and conservation. He has worked on as many as 500 wetland-related projects. That sounds quite a lot, both within the UK and in overseas. And he has knowledge expanding to across a range of wetland types, and has worked with several international and national organizations, among them the Ramsar Convention, UNESCO, the CBD, UN Habitat, etc. Rob is the managing director of an independent environmental consultancy, RM Wetlands and Environment. So let me now give the floor to our first presenter, Nick Davison. Nick, go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Jos. I'm just going to check I have the technology working, which I do. What you're going to hear from us, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or possibly even good night to our attendees, depending on which part of the world you're in. We're going to talk about the Ramsar Convention and the Society of Wetland Scientists and the links between the two. And this is going to be a double act between myself and Rob. And that, by the way, was an image of the river very close to Aldo Leopold's shack in the USA, a very important wetland. So what we're going to cover in this webinar, the first part, which I will speak to, is what exactly is the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands? Why was it set up? What's it trying to achieve? How does it function? And then how does SWS link to Ramsar processes to add value to them? And then I'll hand over to Rob for the second part to talk about the Ramsar 13th Conference of Parties, the COP13, which is about to happen, and what SWS is doing there. So what is the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands? Oh, sorry, there we are. I'm Nick Davidson. I've explained all of that to you. So why do we have a convention on wetlands, an agreement between governments on wetlands? It was developed way back in the 1960s because of increasing concerns, particularly in North America and Western Europe, over the destruction of wetlands and its impacts on people and nature, but at that time, particularly water birds. Very importantly, its development was driven by NGOs, and they still play a big role in the convention. After about 8 years of discussions and negotiations, it finally opened for signature by governments in the city of Ramsar in Iran on the 2nd of February 1971. And for various procedural issues, it didn't actually come into force formally until 1975. But it's the first of the modern global intergovernmental agreements about the environment. And it actually predates formal United Nations attention to the environment. It was way ahead of the game, basically. And Ramsar covers all types of wetlands. Wetlands from the mountains to the sea, and all wetlands, inland, coastal, nearshore, marine, and including not just natural wetlands, but human-made wetlands. I personally believe that the convention's formal text that was adopted is extraordinarily inspirational and far-sighted. It covers wetlands and water, it covers what we now call ecosystems and people. It recognized the fundamental ecological functions of wetlands as regulators of water regimes and as habitats. So the importance of the link between wetlands and wetlands delivering water and managing them for people. It recognized the wetlands as a resource of great economic, cultural, scientific, and recreational value. That's what we now call ecosystem services, the benefits to people. Language was different then, but this is way ahead of the game. And it recognized the loss of this resource would be irreparable. That's powerful language. Its goal is essentially to stem the progressive encroachment on and loss of wetlands now and in the future. That's a goal, unfortunately, as many of you may know, we are still striving to achieve. It's established a whole range of things, including missions and visions. Its mission is conservation and wise use of all wetlands at various spatial scales through local, national actions, international cooperation, but importantly, recognizing that as a contribution to sustainable development. To achieve that, the Convention recognizes that we need to maintain ecosystem services for what they deliver to people. And its vision is that wetlands are conserved, wisely used, restored, and their benefits are recognized and valued by all. The recognized by all is something we still face a challenge on. There are essentially three pillars of implementation of the Convention: the wise use of all wetlands, sustainable use, the designation and management of wetlands of international importance, what we now call generally Ramsar sites, to maintain their character, and international cooperation to achieve this. And as you'll have seen from a couple of these slides, which are photographs taken by Eckhard Keuken, who is probably the last surviving person who was present at the 1971 negotiations when the convention text was adopted, hairstyles have changed considerably since then in the convention. Just to touch on these Ramsar sites, currently there are over 2,300 Ramsar sites, each designated by one or other of the governments who are party to the convention, covering over 250 million hectares of the world. Essentially, in a broad sense, it's the largest global protected area network of any kind. But many more wetlands still qualify for designation that have not been designated. And that's the case in the US, whose, for example, we've only designated 38 Ramsar sites, but many more undoubtedly qualify for designation and should be designated in the future. What's wise use in terms of the Convention understanding? It's the maintenance of wetlands' ecological character, achieved through ecosystem approaches, again, in the context of sustainable development. Wise use involves people and wetlands, not just nature conservation of wetlands for biodiversity. So what is this convention thing? How does it operate? How does it function? It's fairly complicated. That's because it's a formally recognized multilateral environmental agreement, an MEA. Responsibility for its implementation lies with national governments, what we call contracting parties, and there are currently 170 countries who are parties. Its ultimate decision-making body is every 3 years a meeting of the conference of these governments, contracting parties, and the next one is coming up next week, and Rob will explain more about what's happening later. So what happens at a Ramsar COP? Generally, it debates and negotiates the adoption of what it calls decisions. In Ramsar, they call resolutions and recommendations that decide the future work. It receives reports from countries, it approves a work program, and importantly, a budget for the delivery of the convention, and it considers adopting guidance for parties on a whole range of different ongoing and emerging environmental issues. Interestingly, in Ramsar, unlike some other conventions, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, a decision can be decided by voting, a formal vote, but usually, eventually, after tough negotiations, decisions are made by consensus. We've never actually ever got to a formal vote, although it's been very close on a couple of occasions. As well as the governments, contracting parties, other types of organizations participate in the COP as non-voting observers. That's non-member countries who are considering joining the convention, intergovernmental institutions, including UN bodies and so on, and importantly, national and international NGOs. So I'll work through how the convention functions globally. Between these 3 yearly conferences of parties, there's a thing called the Standing Committee, which is representatives of the governments from different regions in the world who meet every year to help progress the work of the convention. It has 2 subsidiary bodies. One, the Scientific and Technical Review Panel, STRP, and then a SEPA Oversight Panel. SEPA is Communications, Education, Participation and Awareness. That was set up in 2005. It has a panel that monitors and reports on the implementation of this area of work within the convention and sets future priorities and reports to the governing bodies. The STRP dates back further. It was established back in 1993 to provide scientific and technical guidance to the convention. It has members who are formally appointed, and they are formed of currently a chairperson and 13 appointed members with expertise in different aspects of wetland conservation, wise use, not just natural science, but importantly socioeconomics as well. We have formally 5, I think it's actually now 6 international organization partners who are long-standing international NGO supporters of the convention, and they have a place on the technical panel as well. And you can see it's a small group. There is a group of the STRP, and you may recognize in that image some familiar faces from SWS meetings as well. Other bodies are invited to participate as observer organizations, and SWS is one of those. The convention is administered by a secretariat which coordinates the day-to-day activities of the convention. It's located in the headquarters of IUCN in Switzerland, in Gland, and is headed by a Secretary General, currently Martha Rueha-Urego, who supervises the work of a very small group, about 20 policy, technical, communications and administrative staff. It's small but perfectly formed. It's got all sorts of responsibilities. It maintains the list of Ramsar sites. It convenes and organizes all the meetings. It supports contracting parties with advice. It disseminates the decisions. It provides support to STRP. It organises what we call Ramsar advisory missions to Ramsar sites that are threatened. But implementation, as I said, is primarily the responsibility of national governments. Each contracting party nationally identifies what is called an administrative authority, an AA, who are responsible for coordinating national implementation of the convention, and it should consult and cooperate with many other government ministries and agencies. The administrative authority often is in nature conservation body or a protected area as part of a ministry, but it can't deliver Ramsar on its own. It has to work with other agencies and bodies in its country to deliver the convention. It designates 4 national focal points, a formal national focal point for the whole implementation of the convention, an STRP focal point, and 2 SEPA focal points, one from government and one from NGOs. Now, let's have a look at SWS and the Ramsar Convention. As I said, Ramsar has always had very strong connections with NGOs and wetland expert organizations, which drove the creation of the convention. SWS itself has had a formal memorandum of cooperation with the Ramsar Secretariat since 1999. And we recently renewed that in 2017 for the period we're now in up until 2023. And there you can see an image of SWS's then president, Gillian Davis, signing with the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention last year. As I said, SWS is an officially recognized observer organization to the Scientific Technical Panel. This allows us to bring SWS's network of wetland experts into supporting the technical and scientific work of the convention. And the conduit, the route through which you do that is through SWS's Ramsar Section. I'm sure some of you listening are already members of our Ramsar Section, but if you're not, please do join us, because you can help us influence the advice and the importance of science and wetland science in the convention. What do we do in the Ramsar section? Well, we aim to organise at each SWS annual conference a symposium on key knowledge gaps to help improve the science base available to Ramsar. And then we also aim to get those results from the symposia out into a wider domain than just those participating in the annual conference. We publish these as journal papers, and we're preparing currently a special issue from Marine and Freshwater Research on assessing and reporting wetland status and trends, which has come out of 2 SWS Ramsar section symposia at conferences. Just a couple of other examples of what SWS expert support has been giving to Ramsar. First, the Global Wetland Outlook. You may have seen announcements about this and publicity about it. It's just been issued. This is the first Global Wetland Outlook, which is being launched formally next week at the COP13. Much of the preparation of the GWO, which has been done by the scientific panel, has actually been led by SWS members, SWS Ramsar section members, particularly Roy Gardner, Max Finlayson, who is our president-elect, myself, Siobhan Fennessy, and Anna Van Dam. So SWS expertise has taken leadership in actually drafting and preparing this hugely important first look at what is happening to the state of the world's wetlands. As part of our assessment of gaps in knowledge, we identified that through the Ramsar section that we don't know very much globally about what the state of our remaining wetlands are. And we organised last year, jointly with the World Wetland Network and Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, a survey on the state of the world's wetlands, and many SWS members contributed to that survey. We thought it was a big gap. We ran it. We got actually over 540, not 450 valid reports, and we're analysing those. They're about to be submitted for journal publication, and we'll be presenting the results for the first time next week at COP13. So as Jos mentioned in his introduction, there's a SWS Twitter conference, the first one ever going on today, and it's looking at through the lens with a series of presentations on Ramsar, the Global Wetland Outlook results and wetland-wise use, with keynote tweeters including Beth Middleton, our current president, Anna Van Dam, myself, Siobhan Fennessy, and Roy Gardner. So please do join in and look at the Twitter symposium, because there's a wealth of information on there. At that point, I will hand off to part two and our part two presenter, Rob McInnes. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nick, and good morning, afternoon, good evening, wherever people may be in the world. Thanks, Nick. Thanks to Jos as moderator, and also to our colleagues in the business office for setting everything up today. Okay, I would like to just take us through what's going to happen at COP. Quick introduction to myself, though. I'm past chair of SWS's Ramsar Section and a former president of the European chapter. And I've been through SWS heavily involved in Ramsar issues for many years now, over 10 years now. So really I want to talk about what's going to happen next week when a whole load of people from the wetland world descend upon Dubai. Every 3 years the contracting parties meet, as Nick alluded to earlier on, and the theme of this year's COP is Wetlands for a Sustainable Urban Future. And we'll all be descending into Dubai in a few days' time and looking at this idea of all these different resolutions, but putting them in the context within Dubai of wetlands for a sustainable future. And I just wanted to dwell on that because I don't know how many people out there have ever been to Dubai. Some of you have had the pleasure, maybe. Some of you might not call it a pleasure, but when you look at Dubai, you don't really think of it as being a global wetland city. But amazingly, in the middle of the city, there is actually a wetland. How sustainable this wetland will be in the long term is debatable. It's being squeezed by development on all sides. But there is a Ramsar site in the middle of the city. It was designated back in 2007, but the site is under intense pressure from urbanization, development, and all the pressures that come with that. And as an example of how SWS can contribute to the work of the Ramsar Convention, a couple of years ago now, myself and Randy Milton, amongst some others, were invited on a Ramsar advisory mission to advise the government of Dubai, or the municipality of Dubai, and the United Arab Emirates as the contracting party, on how they could actually achieve a sustainable future for this urban wetland. And this was, again, an example where a couple of experts were drawn from across the world, but through links through SWS to get us involved. And I'll be very interested, because I've not been back to the site for a couple of years, to see what progress they might have made. So what's going to happen at COP when we all get to Dubai? Well, there'll be representatives of more than about 150 governments. Nick rightly said there's currently 170 governments that are signatories to the Ramsar Convention. However, some governments decide not to send a delegation for a variety of reasons, usually financial. So you end up with about 150 governments. Individual contracting party delegations can be one person, or they can be, in the case of some countries, several people, including many, many lawyers who are there to make legal decisions on behalf of their governments. But there'll also be a whole range of other representatives of countries that are yet to be signatories, from intergovernmental institutions such as other UN institutions, and then a range of national and international NGOs such as SWS will be there as a delegation. And we all meet in a great big meeting room. Sometimes the air conditioning doesn't work and it's quite miserable. Sometimes the air conditioning works too well and it's equally miserable. But basically there's about something up to about 1,500 people in one big room, listening in the plenary sessions to a whole range of discussions. And in most of the discussions, that the meat of the meeting is actually around the decisions, or resolutions as they're called. And it's the responsibility of the sovereign governments to, once they've adopted these resolutions, to take them home to their own countries and transpose them and act upon them within their own domestic context. And in some countries, they transpose them into national laws. Others, they use them in very more sort of generic ways to actually implement them. In Dubai, we're going to be consulting on 26 different draft resolutions, which is quite a lot of resolutions to deal with in about a week. The Ramsar COP lasts about a week, and they cover a range of issues. I'm not going to go into the detail of all of these, but there's a whole range which are standing resolutions almost, which deal with the management of the convention. So looking at the effectiveness of the convention, looking at financial and budgetary matters, looking at how the strategic plan, which is the action plan that the convention's working towards in terms of delivery, how that's going. And then some regional initiatives which the governments around the world have joined up to, for instance, in East Asia or in the Baltic area. There's a whole range of regional initiatives looking at how they're progressing. So a lot of these are very much to do with managing the convention. There is one in there which is quite relevant to SWS, which is the last one on that list, which is looking at what future implementation is required in terms of scientific and technical aspects. And this is where there's an opportunity for SWS to engage, because as contracting parties will raise their concerns or their issues, they will seek advice from convention and from the technical body, the scientific and technical bodies of the convention. And once they sign off on that resolution in terms of setting the work program for the scientific and technical review panel, then SWS has an opportunity at that point to contribute and to offer advice or support to various tasks within that. And we've done that over the last few years very successfully, as Nick's alluded to earlier on. And then there'll be a whole range of resolutions which will be discussed, which cover technical aspects of the convention. And again, I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail. If anyone wants to look at these, they're available on the Ramsar website. If you just type into any search engine, Ramsar COP13 resolutions, you'll get taken straight there. But there are some which I will sort of just flag up very quickly, which could be interesting. So there's several resolutions which are talking to climate change, to peatland restoration, blue carbon, etc. They could be quite interesting because parties get quite animated when it comes to climate change. There's also a whole range of other resolutions going forward, including some new ones which have come onto the agenda, looking at peace and security and gender issues. But some other resolutions which have been looked at in the past, such as issues to do with agriculture. But there's also a couple of interesting ones that are coming up this time, which I'll be quite curious to see the debates on, especially to do with small wetlands and polar and subpolar wetlands, because this is where the convention is trying to focus in on different types of wetlands within a broader context. And SWS have been involved in this process of producing these draft resolutions. These are usually run to several pages of text, which is quite carefully crafted. And then what will happen during the COP process is the text will be redrafted as individual countries might have an issue with certain wordings. They might have an issue in terms of what it's actually going to be tying them into. And they're concerned that their country might not be able to uphold those obligations or might not want to uphold those obligations. So there's a lot of wordsmithing done once we're into the COP, but already a lot of work's gone into this. And SWS members have been involved in several already, including the peatlands and climate change draft resolutions, the blue carbon ones, issues on sustainable urbanization, the rapid assessment of wetland ecosystem services, and the agricultural resolutions. And so already in the drafting of these, SWS members have been involved and contributed text to these resolutions. The ones that I think will be key issues, which are always the key issues quite often at COPs, climate change. They're always contentious. There are many parties who are contracting parties to the Ramsar Convention that firmly believe that climate change should only be discussed under the United Nations Convention for Climate Change. It shouldn't be discussed under Ramsar, and wetlands have nothing to do with climate change. And so, as anyone who's got any knowledge of wetlands knows that wetlands do have a role to play in climate change. These are always interested, heated, and usually very long-lasting discussions, and I expect they'll be exactly the same at this COP, going into the small wee hours of the morning, no doubt. There's also some parties are very sensitive about the language, especially around cultural values, indigenous peoples, local communities. And this is, I always find very interesting, because this is where you get very different perspectives on how wetlands are important, how they're managed across different cultural landscapes. And this is when you realize that being involved in Ramsar issues is very much a global issue. You're not just looking at it through the lens of your own country, you're looking at it on a global basis. And I find those sort of discussions can be quite interesting because it challenges some of your visions of normality. There's a new area on peace and security, which the convention's not really taken an active role in previously. And so that's going to be quite interesting to see how the discussions will go on that. And the one that's always very interesting is the financial challenges that the convention faces and how different parties view the financing of the convention. So these are ones, I think, some of the key issues that will be discussed. But from a personal point of view, what I'm interested in, I'm interested on how a convention reports on its progress. At the previous COP in Uruguay 3 years ago, there was a strategic plan was adopted, and following on from what Nick said about the citizen science survey that was conducted through SWS membership and other organizations, what we're showing is actually progress against the strategic plan is pretty poor. It's and in some parts of the world, progress is actually well, barely called progress at all, I suppose. So it'll be very interesting to see how parties are actually going to report back against the strategic plan to actually say how they're meeting or maybe not meeting their obligations. I think the wise use of intertidal wetlands will be interesting. It's an area which the convention again hasn't looked at specifically. It's been picked up in several other several other resolutions, but very much interested in terms of the context of intertidal wetlands, especially the developmental pressures that are on them in the Far East in particular, and their role in blue carbon. I'm also curious why small wetlands should be treated differently to other types of wetlands, and this is me just being pedantic, because where do you draw a line on what is small and what is large? Because when we did the citizen science survey, the smallest wetland that was in all the 600 or so responses we had and of the 540 or so which were usable, the smallest wetland was the garden pond, which is sitting about 10 meters away from where I'm sitting at the moment. It was my own garden pond, which I would say was a small wetland. But then there are other wetlands of similar sizes which could also be called small, which might be up to 1 hectare, 2 hectares. So what is a small wetland? And I'm just purely from a curiosity point of view, I'm interested in why small wetlands are being picked out and what the convention has to say about them. And then I'm also very interested in the financial issues, because quite often contracting parties will use this as an excuse for inaction. So certain parties will say, well, we'd love to do all these wonderful ideas and ambitions which the convention's asking us to do, but we don't have the money to do it. And so how does the convention actually overcome these financial challenges? And also for the people who are listening from North America, it'll be very interesting to see whether the USA delegation, who've always been incredibly supportive of the Ramsar Convention, whether their views towards financing has changed since a new administration has come in. So that's going to be quite interesting from a US domestic politic point of view. But history has taught me well at conventions that the best thing you can really do is keep your head down most of the time. And sometimes it's best if you pretend you haven't seen or heard or actually said anything which could get you into trouble. And this is 3 SWS members at a COP in Romania in 2012, where we thought, right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to see no evil, we're going to hear no evil, and we're going to speak no evil. We're just going to sit here and get on with our jobs. One of the other things that happens at COPs is things called side events. And this is where either contracting parties might be interested in running a side event as a way of communicating or disseminating information around a particular resolution, or it might be an NGO or an international NGO might want to provide information about a recent piece of work, a publication, or an initiative. Or it might be different contracting parties are coming together talking about international cooperation, one of those 3 pillars of the convention that Nick mentioned earlier on. And these can be very, very interesting. Now, this COP, there are a couple of side events which SWS has actually directly contributed towards and will be running. One which will be reporting back on the citizen science survey, and one is looking at climate management and adaptation and some of the key legal issues for Ramsar wetlands around that. So Nick and myself and Matt Simpson, who's the president of the European chapter, will be convening and moderating and presenting in the side event on citizen science. We'll describe the results and we'll explain what the implications of those results might actually mean for the Ramsar Convention, especially for the management of Ramsar sites. And this, hopefully the SWS membership will get to see very soon, because we're hoping to submit a formal paper based on the analysis that we've done, which should be going, hopefully we're submitting it within the next week or so. We'll finalize the paper when we're together in Dubai. And this will be quite interesting, because this is very much a grassroots initiative. This isn't coming from governments, it's coming from NGOs, from the bottom up, and from wetland managers, some of which might be on this call, many from the US and right across the world, who've given their own take on the condition, the state of those wetlands and the trend, whether those wetlands are improving or degrading and deteriorating. And it's a chance for SWS to communicate this to contracting parties and to other people who are at the conference. And then the second side event we'll be running will be on climate management adaptation and key legal issues. This is being organised and run by our current president, Beth Middleton, and our president-elect, Max Finlayson, with Nick moderating and Roy Gardner also contributing on the legal issues. And this will look at some of the current scientific and legal thinking around issues to do with climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and the role that wetlands play in that. And the discussions will be very much targeted at helping to inform the contracting parties on several of these draft resolutions, which are picking up on issues of climate change. And this is very much using the scientific expertise that exists in SWS, feeding that through synthesis and publications to actually inform directly the side event, which hopefully as contracting parties attend this, they'll listen to and can take that knowledge with them into the plenary sessions where they're debating the draft resolutions. As well as side events, SWS will be at the COP, and there'll be several of us there as formal delegates. So myself and Beth will be there formally as delegates, but there'll also be many, many SWS members who will be there, such as Roy Gardner through his involvement in STRP, Max Finlayson, and several other people from across the world. So hopefully Waitar Fang, president of the Asia chapter, will be there. Matt Simpson, president of the European chapter, will be there. So there'll be several people representing SWS, and we'll be able to play certain roles whilst we're there. Some of us will be supporting contracting parties, so we'll be directly advising contracting parties on the wording of resolutions, the content, the technical content. And Nick's going to be doing this on behalf of the Myanmar government. I'm going to be supporting the Republic of South Korean government. But we'll also have people there in discussing with other observer organizations. These are formally recognized organizations such as SWS, but also international organization partners. So for instance, Matt Simpson, the European president, is also part of the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust delegation, who are one of the IOPs. And again, so SWS members will be playing dual roles there. Also, several SWS members are on the scientific and technical review panel and will be directly contributing to some of the debates and some of the helping out in drafting and redrafting these resolutions once they've been discussed in plenary, and as contracting parties want to wordsmith and change the wordings of the resolutions. And also it gives us a chance whilst we're there to liaise with governments and actually talk to governments, to actually, when we hear them discussing issues, we can then follow up, and we can put SWS in the shop window by saying, well, if you need technical assistance on certain issues, there is a society out there where we have a vast membership covering huge amounts of skills that we can offer to try and support governments. And likewise, discussing things with the Ramsar Secretariat. As Nick said, the Secretariat is very small. It's only around 20 or so people. So we can discuss things with them and again, offer support through SWS channels. And also, this is a great opportunity to promote the society and the good work that the society does, and the society's membership, and right across the board in terms of the fact that we are global, we have global chapters, we have a presence across the world, and actually just promoting SWS as a way to look to recruit new membership, but also to raise the profile of the society. And so for those of you that are interested, and if you are at a loose end next week and have nothing to do and you're sitting there trying to pretend you're working so you can go onto the internet, the whole process is basically uploaded to the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. And there's daily reporting, there's live streams, there's photos. And if you go onto this web address here, which will be available if you download the actual PDF of the webinar, and there's regular updates, and you'll be able to tune in and watch some of it streamed live if you're so interested. So that's really where we are. So I just thought I'd throw in a couple of final thoughts before I hand back over to Jos to moderate any questions that have come in. But just a couple of things I thought I'd throw out there is that if people have found this interesting and they really want to understand better how SWS interacts with the Ramsar Convention, this global convention, well, one of the best ways to do that would be to join the Ramsar section, or if you come to our annual conference, to come along to the SWS Ramsar Section Symposium and to interact with the actual section. The other thing that I always like to ask people is, are there other ways that SWS, or actually as a society or as individuals through SWS, can get involved in the Ramsar Convention? Because it never ceases to amaze me when I talk to SWS members that there's quite a lot of appetite and interest in actually supporting and getting involved with Ramsar related issues on a national level or on a global level. And so if there's ways that people think that they could contribute or get involved, then they should think about that as well. But that sort of concludes the formal part of the webinar. So on behalf of my co-presenter Nick and myself, I'd like to say thank you, and I'll hand back to Jos to handle any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick and Rob, for very interesting presentations and giving a global idea of Ramsar as an organization and the way they work, and also the links between SWS and Ramsar, and also giving us a nice insight in what's going to happen next week in Dubai in the next COP. So that's all fun to hear about, and definitely questions have come in, and maybe I can first add on to what you said, Rob. Are people interested in becoming involved in the Ramsar section? There is one listener who has expressed that he definitely wants to become involved, and I read what he has written here. I'm a member of SWS. How can I join the Ramsar section? I will be in the COP13 as of October 25, and I will try to react on the 21st. So, and this is from Ahmad Madavi in Iran. So he at least is interested. So maybe you can try to connect with him while you are there, and he will definitely try to connect with you as well. So that's already an outcome of this webinar, which is quite nice, I would think, and also fits to what you say. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, just to respond to that, Jos, and to Ahmad, the best way to interact with us at the COP is there will be towards the back of the plenary hall. There will be placeholders and there'll be name tags on the tables. SWS will have a formal slot, and either Beth Middleton or myself or Nick or some others of us will be around that location. So please come and find us if we can't find you. And the easiest way to join the Ramsar section is just to tick that little box on your membership and pay your $5, and you can become a member of the SWS Ramsar section.
Absolutely. And Nick here, just to add, until we get to the COP, we're never quite sure how all the nameplate labeling will work, and it varies and has shared between COPs. In some COPs, it's simply been a patch towards the back of the plenary hall, which just says observers or NGOs, and you need to walk around that if there are no specific labels to find somebody, Rob or Beth, wearing an SWS badge. Or alternatively, I will actually be on the delegation of the government of Myanmar, so you can always find me at the Myanmar contracting party seats further to the front of the hall, and we'd be happy to discuss further with you in COP.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I have a request for the staff, the technical support. Can they bring back the slide on the Twitter symposium? Because somebody has asked how to join. So if we just show this slide again during the questions, that would be probably convenient. And then I go to the next.
On that point, Jos, if it's any help, I actually did a presentation in the Twitter symposium earlier today, and to my absolute amazement, as a total neophyte on Twitter, I only joined last week for this purpose, it actually worked, and there's a lot of really good presentations up there worth seeing. And just the first link when that slide comes up is it's the SWS Twitter Symposium link. That first one, SWS Twitter Symposium 2018, you can get onto that Twitter page and see all the presentations that have already been presented earlier today, and there's more going on as we speak.
And also you can also go to this website, which is listed at the bottom, which gives more information about it. So that's also a useful link to explore. So then, if I may, I go to the next question by Alana Rebello, who asks how the Ramsar team handle some countries using draft resolutions as political tools or weapons. For example, there have been concerns raised over the Chinese proposal on the small wetlands, as the monitoring of these small wetlands would require certain imagery and tools, which they may then have an opportunity to sell. Is Ramsar aware of this, and how do they deal with it?
Well, Nick here. The convention is essentially owned by its governments, its contracting parties, and that sometimes is very powerful, but sometimes can limit what the convention can achieve, depending on what the contracting parties decide. As we said in the presentations, bodies like SWS and its experts can help try and work with those parties to influence them in doing the right thing. But ultimately, an intergovernmental convention, a formal multilateral environmental agreement, is a matter for deciding and arguing between the governments of the world themselves. Others can help contribute, but it's the governments make the decisions. One of the issues that has repeatedly come up is for all these great ideas for new resolutions, new decisions to be adopted by the convention, what's the cost of doing it? And there is a very interesting document that the Ramsar Secretariat was requested to prepare, which looks at the cost implications of implementing each of these conventions. You can find that on the Ramsar COP13 page. It's one of the documents up there, and it would be well worth you finding that and having a look at it to see whether you feel the Secretariat's analysis adequately reflects the sort of points you're making. So the level of monitoring of wetlands globally is pitifully poor, any size of wetland. And possibly there's a huge ambition and belief that Earth observation, remote sensing will solve it all for us. At the moment, it has not managed to do that. It is not sufficiently far advanced, and it is very expensive to do it precisely for wetlands, because wetlands are actually rather hard to find when you look down from a satellite. Most people use Landsat imagery because it's now freely available, but Landsat doesn't spot wetlands underneath trees, for example. And so we know from the analyses that I, Max Finnis, and others have been doing recently that many of these global attempts to assess how big wetlands, how much wetland have we got and where are they, using existing Earth observation technology, does not deliver the answer. It wildly underestimates how much wetland we've got. And finding small wetlands means high resolution Earth observation, and that is very costly indeed. So it's work in progress, but as you say, understanding the implications of some of the decisions that may be negotiated and adopted need to be very clear to parties. And I'm sure some parties are likely to raise just these sort of issues on the small wetland resolution. Rob, do you have any comments on that?
All I want to add is that it never ceases to amaze me when you go to COPs that they are inherently political. There's certain things that you're just almost sitting there waiting for them to happen. So, for instance, every time the UK take the floor, the Argentinians will follow by demanding that the Falkland Islands, Las Malvinas, should actually be Argentinian. So you have these little political footballs that get thrown around. You can guarantee that if climate change comes up, the Brazilians will interject and say that climate change is not to be discussed under a Ramsar. It is for the UN Climate Change Convention to discuss. So the whole process, because it involves governments, is inherently political. And governments, individual governments, will have their own little battles that they will set out to fight. And when you've been involved in this process for several years, like Nick and myself have, you just sit there waiting. You almost know when they're going to come on. You know that these political footballs will get kicked around the room. But that's the nature of international conventions, intergovernmental conventions rather, that they are inherently political. I think one of the roles that SWS play and SWS members play extremely well is we try not to be political, and we try to focus on what the science is telling us. And sometimes that can be incredibly frustrating when you're sitting in a small contact group, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and you've got 3 or 4 different governments sitting with you, and you're debating literally 3 words in a paragraph, and you've been debating the same 3 words maybe for 2 hours. And you're trying to sort of apply some scientific sense to this, but actually all they want is the political sense. They want that political logic to represent their views rather than the scientific logic to represent what is actually the reality of wetlands. So these processes are inherently political, and it can be frustrating at times. But as Nick said, ultimately what you end up with, to date anyway, is a consensus, that the politics is dealt with in such a way that you end up with a consensus rather than having to go to a vote and then people feeling like there's been winners and losers. So you can't detach the political from the bigger process, but it will always vary from resolution to resolution and country to country. And I suspect it will be exactly the same next week in Dubai, which is why I said I think the climate change ones, and there are several resolutions that are picking up on climate change related issues. It will be very interesting to see how they go forward.
Okay, thank you very much both for these thoughts about more political aspects from this question. There is another question which is a bit more technical, and that is asked by John Marshall, and the question is there a collective geospatial repository of database of Ramsar sites, vector and or raster and attribute data? And if so, how is access to the data managed?
Nick?
Thank you very much. The Ramsar Secretariat maintains what is called the Ramsar Sites Information Service, which is an online information source about all the 2,300 plus Ramsar sites that have been designated by each contracting party. You can access that if you Google Ramsar Site Information Service, RSIS, you will find it. On that, you can search in a number of different ways into an underlying database of the attributes of each site. You can search by country, you can search by region, you can search by type of wetland, you can search by date of designation, and so on. Doesn't allow you to search everything that you possibly might want to get at. But if you can't get at it through the search options that are available online, you contact the Ramsar Secretariat and ask for them to extract the information you need. Geospatially, it's been a long-standing struggle to get good geospatial information on each and every Ramsar site. At its basic, we have a centroid geospatial location for the site, but that's not that helpful if it's a site of several million hectares. Contracting parties are now required, when they designate a new site or update the information on an existing site, to provide a geospatial boundary as a georeference boundary which can be downloaded from the Ramsar Site Information Service. It does not yet exist for, by any means, all Ramsar sites in the world, but where it does, you can view it and it's available. So I would suggest have a look at the Ramsar Sites Information Service, have a dig around it and see if you can get at what you need to find. And if you can't, contact the Ramsar Secretariat and ask for their help in accessing the underlying information you might need to get, if it exists and is available.
The other thing I would add, Nick, is that it's also through Google Earth, you can actually import either by region or for the whole world, the centroids for all the Ramsar sites. And some of those do actually have, where the georeference boundary maps have been included, some of those do come into Google Earth. So you can actually import it into Google Earth as well. So there's two sources, the Ramsar Sites Information Service, and also you can access some data, not the attribute data, but the actual location and some of the geospatial data through Google Earth.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you, for the very clear replies. And there is another question here from Louis Mantini. Does Ramsar have the UN's ear? Is there any cooperation between these two international organizations?
Oh, the
Right.
ear of the UN.
Yes.
Ramsar is quite unusual. It is a formally, legally recognized treaty under the United Nations. That is the Ramsar Convention itself as an intergovernmental treaty. Over the past 10 years, there has been a huge debate about who should administer the convention, the Secretariat of the convention, which has been, because of historical traditional reasons, actually is supported by IUCN, the World Conservation Union. And it is the only Secretariat of an intergovernmental environmental agreement which is not, where the Secretariat is not administered by a UN organization such as the United Nations Environment Programme. There has been a huge amount of confusion around all of this. It is formally recognized by the United Nations. It participates in UN processes and meetings as an intergovernmental treaty on a level playing field with others such as the Climate Change Convention, Biodiversity Convention, Desertification Convention, and so on. It is solely that the Secretariat is actually run by its contracting parties solely. The Secretariat is only responsible to the governments who are members of the convention. It is not responsible to any other United Nations organization. Talking with those other convention secretariats who are administered by a United Nations organization, they're also guided by their contracting parties, and there's a real problem between those two components of how they're administered. So in many ways, Ramsar actually benefits from being slightly outside for the Secretariat itself, but wholly inside UN processes for the business of it being a convention and a treaty.
Okay, thanks a lot. We are coming to the end, but there is one question that I still want to ask. It's a question by Kent Glade. He says, what's the best way to connect with wetland entities? For example, I follow SWS and Ramsar and cannot get follow backs. Is there a wetland Twitter group?
As I said, I've only started to tweet today.
Yes.
So I'm probably not the right person to ask because I'm too old for this sort of stuff. But actually, it works well. I'm sure there are. There are many wetland organizations, for example, Wetlands International, that are active tweeters and have active social media presence, as does the SWS. There's no one entity. There are many, many different organizations involved in wetlands around the world. And many of the major NGOs, IUCN have a water program, WWF has freshwater programs and so on, are very, very closely involved in wetlands. wetlands. But I fear, unless Rob knows otherwise, there is no one-stop shop for all the information about wetlands you might want to ask, except for something called the Wetland Book. We haven't mentioned that. Some of you may have come across it. It has been recently published as a kind of encyclopedia of everything you wanted to know about wetlands but never knew who to ask. Unfortunately, it is it's an online and a print publication. The print publication is 2 books, 6 volumes, and 4,300 pages. So in there somewhere should be almost everything you need the answer for a question. Unfortunately, to get at it is not cheap. But there is no one-stop shop, I think, or website or anything that tells you everything about wetlands you ever wanted to know. Maybe we should encourage our questioners to set one up.
We have to cut it a bit short, but this Twitter symposium is a good start, I think. And I have the feeling that SWS wants to exercise these kind of interactions more often. They see the Twitter symposium as a very good model, as I understand it from the website associated with it. Maybe, if I may, there is one final question that's really the final one and can only have a brief answer. I don't know whether you know, at COP13, what sort of representation is anticipated from North American government agencies and NGOs? A question from Brian C. Sullivan.
The formal administrative authority for USA for Ramsar is the US Fish and Wildlife Service. They will be there along with the US State Department.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Canada and Mexico, which are the other 2 countries in the North American region, will undoubtedly be there and have both been very active in convention processes and COPs in the past, and I'm sure they will be there. I don't have the list of participants yet, but certainly US Fish and Wildlife and State Department will be there and heavily involved in the discussions.
Yep. Yeah. And just to echo that, yeah, I mean, Mexico and Canada have always been very active. And it's interesting to note that out of all the countries on the planet that are signatories to the Ramsar Convention, after the United Kingdom, Mexico has the 2nd most Ramsar sites of any contracting party. So they're very engaged with the Ramsar Convention.
And we look to USA to follow Mexico's lead on Ramsar Sites.
They've got a long way to go.
Okay. Well, Nick and Rob, thank you very, very much for the very entertaining presentations and discussion. It was really very nice. We really have to end this session now. And you see on this final slide that our next seminar is already planned for November 15, Wetlands of the Coast of Lima, Patterns of Diversity and Challenges for Conservation, from Hector Aponte. So that would be really a very interesting webinar from South America, and we are looking forward to that. All viewers, thank you very much, and I hope you will have a very good day and that you will think about the Ramsar COP meeting in your mind the coming days. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, yes, and thank you everyone else.
Thank you,